Good evening and welcome to this discussion today with Professor Abhijit Banerjee from MIT. Welcome, Dr. Banerjee, again.
Thank you. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. I want to start with a broad question on the Indian economy. We began this year with significant weakness in the economy, right? In the first 3 months of the year itself, the economy was struggling. And then we were hit by the pandemic, growth completely collapsed, or rather output collapsed. And then we've seen this gradual recovery. Now, various people read it differently. Some people say that it's a V-shaped bounce and things are going to be normal very quickly. Some people are more circumspect. They say that we haven't seen the end of the tunnel is still away. So what is your assessment as you see the data coming in, as you do your own field work? How do you assess the strength of this current economic recovery?
I'm in principle against being too much of a tea leaf reader. It's very hard to say, and whatever I say will probably be wrong. I think there are two issues to worry about. One is the pandemic, which I don't know exactly why we are going down right now. It's clear that the measured infection rate is going down. There are places where it's jumping up, but a lot of places where it's going down. I don't think we understand that. And because we don't understand that, I don't think we have a basis for assuming that we're out of the pandemic. I think that is not to say that it's, I think we should not be pessimistic unnecessarily, but I think there is no guarantee that we're out of the pandemic, because I don't think we have a coherent explanation of why it should be going down. And the vaccines, I think that's right now, it's a long way away, I think. I'm guessing another 2 quarters before anybody really seriously gets vaccinated. And then we need the 2 quarters to figure out actually how we would vaccinate 1.4 billion people, or whatever fraction of that we plan to vaccinate. And that's another set of issues we haven't quite understood, because the vaccine actually doesn't offer protection from transmission. As far as I can tell, the 2 vaccines that are approved are not. So we need to vaccinate actually the whole population if that's what we're going to do. So there's a whole set of issues on that. Second, I think that the bounce has been slow actually. I mean, after a 24% reduction, you might have imagined that we would get a 15% bounce up. We got an 8% bounce up. And we're going to end the year at about 10% short of where we were. I think there are reasons why can be sticky, and then one of them is just there's been a massive demand shock. A lot of people were cleaned out. Investment is very slow, and is very slow because we're really much of our investment, it turns out, is domestic economy focused, and our domestic economy is not offering huge rewards right now. So people are sitting on their money. I think that we need a demand bounce, and the demand bounce hasn't happened yet. So I think that people are scared. They're sitting on whatever cash they have. So I don't know how quickly the recovery will be. I think if people gain confidence that the economy will recover, then they will indeed start spending, and then so it's a bit of a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, in fact.
So if I understood right, the initial supply shock has now led to a longer-term demand shock, where people are basically, precautionary savings are rising. People are being very circumspect about future plans. So now, usually in such situations, especially if your exports are not growing and your domestic demand is weak, the government is the big player in town. What is your assessment of the response of public policy to the macroeconomic situation? Because a lot of the heavy lifting has been done by monetary policy, by the RBI. The fiscal response has been much more modest. So what is your assessment of the response of public policy to this macroeconomic problem?
So I think the public policy took as its primary goal to make sure that the banks don't collapse. I think that was the first order of public policy. And therefore, and to ensure that loans were written off, or at least rescheduled. I think that was the big piece of public policy. And I think the reason why that was important is that it was clear that the banking sector was already on very shaky ground before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic would have just sent it into a tailspin. And I think the government was right in thinking that it needs to do something about it. Now, whether it was right about how much of a deficit it could run or not, I think it could have run a bigger deficit. But I think the primary focus was on bailing out the banking sector. The loan rescheduling was central always in what it did. It's the one thing that I think was done to a significant extent. The loans were you didn't have to pay them, and then some transfers were made to the banking sector to compensate it. And I think that seems to be the central piece of the policy. And I see why that was important. I think the banking sector, I still don't think the banking sector is out of the woods, but I think that, and I think the Reserve Bank agrees with that. I think their view is that the banking sector is sort of out of the woods. And but I think that was the focus of the policy response, and then everything else was sort of secondary to that. And maybe the government felt that that's so expensive that they couldn't afford to do much else.
Do you think that the fiscal response means the fiscal deficit has widened, but a lot of it is because of the decline in tax revenues? It's not because of extra spending, so the fiscal impulse has been weak, so to say. I understand what you're saying, that the initial thing was to protect the banks, but at least now that you've identified a demand shock as a significant challenge, is there a stronger case for fiscal expansion led by spending?
I've always taken the view that there should be more fiscal stimulus. I think the question is always reading how much of a deficit the government is willing to run. I think the government decided that its primary commitment was to bail out the banking sector, and that it couldn't afford more than that. And now I would have thought that this was the time to do radical things like sell the banks to some foreign bank. And, I think this is a sort of, in that sense, I think this is a wasted crisis. I think we could have done more. We could have been, I think on the fiscal side, we could have been more aggressive. And I think, selling the banks, I really do think that we are sitting on our hands more than we should be in this moment, because I think if people's expectations are frozen at a very low level, I think we will be stuck there. I'm a bit worried about that. I think people are, especially I think workers, to the extent that I can tell, which is very little because I have not been to India in the last 1 year, and which is something I regret. So I can't say that I've been in the field doing field work, but from talking to other people who are doing field work now, I feel that there is a sense in which people are scared of traveling, of going out, or migrating out, etc. So there's a lot of stickiness, or even on the supply side, I would say. And I think we need a boom to undo the stickiness. People leave feeling that it's going to be great, they should go.
So thanks. So Abhijit, one more issue which sort of, you've mentioned the state of the banking sector, which of course we entered the crisis with a weak banking sector, and then there's been this shock. You also mentioned the weak domestic demand. Another problem which sort of hit us in our face, so to say, was this entire migrant crisis. You see, we saw these caravans of people going home, and large spike in unemployment, people moved back to the villages. What does it tell us about India's social security system? Now, you've obviously done a lot of work on this, but has that also exposed, so to say, the soft underbelly of the Indian social
system? We kind of knew this problem, right? We have a social security system that's tied to the domicile of the person. The government recognizes this. I'm not saying anything original. I think everybody understands that this was something that was designed. Once you build a social security system that's finally located in the domicile, and you have some very large number of migrants, we don't even know how many. And in a sense, that itself is a problem, because we sort of have lived in this world where there is no survey that tells you how many migrants there are.
Yeah.
There's no, just and how long they migrate for, and exactly where they are, and how many people from Bihar or from Ara in Bihar are in Surat in Gujarat. This is stuff we don't know. And as a result, we also are in some ways it's not a measured problem, it's not a problem. So we have never really confronted the magnitude of the integration of the Indian economy that has happened. So, I was talking to people in Tamil Nadu, and they were talking about sending buses to Bihar to recruit people back to Tamil Nadu. And this is some months ago, actually. They already were worrying about this. So it's really a huge problem. In Tamil Nadu, they just don't have enough people who are willing to do the jobs they want them to do. And that integration we haven't really taken seriously. The social security system is based on that. The second part of it, which I want to emphasize, is our urban housing policy is disastrous. There is no place. If I were somebody making, let's say, 400 rupees a day, which is not a bad earning for somebody with limited education. They're making 400 rupees a day, 500 rupees a day in Mumbai, but it's absolutely no place for me to live. I mean, there is literally, I couldn't afford anything. And so what I do is I sleep in my construction site. Now that has the consequence that people who should be, spending 3 years in Mumbai, upgrading their skills, getting better and better jobs, after 3 months, they just say, okay, I can't take this, I'm going home. And then they come back after a couple of months. And so there's very little continuity in employment, or at least we don't know how much continuity there is. Maybe I should also say that I don't actually know how much continuity there is. The kind of the very anecdotal data I know is that people just say, oh yeah, I left. I've done a little bit of this in West Bengal, where there's a lot of out-migration. And so I think that those things, I mean, there is no temporary housing for very low income people. That's just not an option. You can't afford a hotel, so there is no place to stay.
So Abhijit, it's interesting. Basically, one of the points you're making is that the Indian economy has integrated, but the social security system hasn't integrated as well. And in a way, the labor market tends to be fragmented in terms of who is responsible for the welfare of the laborers. Now, just a question: a lot of the labor which moved back, they got absorbed either on the family farm or through some sort of NREGA work. And there's been a large increase in demand for that sort of work.
Yeah.
Do you think an urban NREGA would have reduced the problems? People like Jean Drèze have recommended it. So has, economists at Azim Premji University. So do you think that is something which deserves serious thought?
I think the question with NREGA is, some portable social support system deserves thought. Whether it should be work-based or not, the work creates many forms of stickiness, including, I think, the fact that while demand has gone up, supply has only responded in some places, not others, because the supply depends on all kinds of planning that the panchayat sachiv has to do, and there's all kinds of steps in that process, which makes the fact that it's not particularly responsive. We looked at this a little bit in the data, and you can see basically what fraction of the income loss due to, let's say, bad rainfall is covered by something like energy. It's small, because essentially the responsiveness. So I'm not sure that it would have been suddenly in March they would have to plan, a whole slew of projects and start them and get the in the middle of a pandemic, they would have to get the inputs for building something. What would you do with the labor? So I think we need to rethink the question of using labor. I mean, there are ways to use labor. In a sense, but I think it's very important to not try to mimic NREGA. I think we should start by sort of opening the problem. Is it okay if we just give people cash without any, if as long as they stand in line once a week, we give them cash? Is that acceptable? Why is it not acceptable? If it's not acceptable, then what's the next best thing we can do? Is it how much trouble should we make go into to make sure that we are getting people who really we want to target? And there's advantages to NREGA. I assume it targets reasonably well, not perfectly, because the geographical targeting is weak, but within geography the target is pretty good. But on the other hand, you might worry that this is too clunky a system. If we are going to respond to a pandemic in a city, where is the land where we're going to build something? I mean, just the thinking through that we're not going to dig up whatever Shivaji Park in Bombay. So where will we build? I mean, this is just a set of issues that we need to think through. I don't want to. I've sort of been holding off from that debate because I feel there's a knee-jerk translation of NREGA, which I resist, because I think it's not easy to do and it's not particularly good at responding to urgent needs.
Thank you. This brings me to another question, because in a way, you're also moving into this area of federalism, right? That you have an integrated economy. There are states with certain powers, center with certain powers, some shared powers in the constitution. And I really want to ask you this question, which I know it interests you a lot, about the broader federal structure, right? And what has seen in the past few years is sort of a breakdown in trust. The GST negotiations were one part of it, but there's also a lot of other things about, whether the state should be doing it, whether the center should be doing it. So how do you think there's a case for rethinking Indian federalism in terms of the distribution of powers? And we are very often just don't mention the third tier, which is actually constitutionally there in our system. So any thoughts on what this pandemic and also some of the recent debates tell us about the future of Indian federalism?
I think there are at least there's 50 issues there. Okay? If somebody could spend their life worrying about this. But I think there's the issue of the third tier, which is I'm glad you raised it, because I think the state is way too big. Indian states are way too big also. We need much more federalism within the state. The states are way too big and too clunky and too unable to focus on specific areas. Just some fact that is worth thinking about. We have 540 MPs for a population of 1.4 billion or 1.3 billion, some number like that. Okay, the UK has maybe 55 million people, 60 million people, and 635 MPs, something like that. It's so. The MPs the constituencies are too big. At all levels, we have sort of not adjusted to the scale. The constituencies are so big that, if I'm an MP, I can't really be useful to most people in my constituency. My constituency is so big that I can't possibly even meet a very small fraction of it. It's just the numbers are wrong at some level. We are really talking about things which are, the scale is wrong. So I think we need to think through this whole, who should have what powers, and, to the extent that we have the states are therefore too big, and the assembly constituencies are too big. Everything is off scale, in my view. And that's a deep problem which has, and then there's the question of sort of the current issue of federalism, where I think you can see this in the current crisis over the farmers, and at some level I feel that the farmers are essentially acting out of pure suspicion of the government's motives. It's really not, what they're saying is not that these reforms could not be good, but they're saying we think this is just the thin end of the wedge, and that something else much worse is about to happen. And I think there is a general loss of trust, especially I think when you have people who are very far away, who have very little connection to you at the moment, doing very large-scale legislation. So this is less about the state than about the relationship with the overall state with its people. I think this is a natural reaction. People are, I think it's not so much that you couldn't make a case for, getting rid of many of these very, old-fashioned institutions we have in the agriculture sector. You absolutely could. But I think the lack of trust is massive. And I think that lack of trust was, the sudden sort of cancelling of the centre's liabilities under the GST Act doesn't help. I think you create these things and you say that, well, we are going to have power delivered from top down, and we're going to just take decisions by people who really don't have much of a connection to the affected people, and you're going to get that. You have to somehow have built. Sorry, I got a cold. We have winter here in Paris. Yeah. So it's I think that the general paradigm of trust in this is the state is one player in that. The states are, are in a sense, you can see exactly that they are also lining up on partisan lines. There's very few state governments that are crossing partisan lines. And so the states are partly also acting out of their own political interest. But I think the broader picture is very much that there is a lack of trust in the entire system. And federalism is just one piece of that. It does, you build trust partly by having people that you talk to, who have given you something. If everything is decided by somebody who's in some space a million miles away, then I think it's very easy to have completely, maybe inaccurate, but certainly completely negative views of what their motives are, because they might have good motives, but you don't know them. You've seen what they do at some very big picture level. They defaulted on the GST claims, etc. And so do you trust them? I think this particular crisis is absolutely about trust. It's really not about the content of the legislation. I think many people, even in Punjab, have argued for changes in the past, and they are backtracking, partly because they know that the real issue is not the law, but the trust.
So, Abhijit, I know you're not a big fan of reading the tea leaves of making forecasts, but just to stay on this issue of federalism, we saw that from the 80s, there was a certain move towards political decentralization and fiscal decentralization. Do you think that era is now over and we are moving into a system, even some of the, what we read about the 15th Finance Commission, etc., that there's a certain amount of re-centralization in the Indian polity and in the federal structure?
I don't know that we are anywhere close to an equilibrium. I think there is I think when there is a lot of pressure, most authorities just want to impose the will on the system. That's in some ways, it's a very natural response, is that, there's just too many pressures on us. Right now, so I think that whether in the medium run, one of the things that would be interesting to see is, for example, what happens in Haryana. How long does the Haryana state government withstand the pressure from its own farmers? I think that's going to be an interesting question. So I think we're not in an equilibrium. I think that, in fact, all the negotiation will eventually have to go through some state governments. And I think the Haryana state government, in many ways, being a BJP government, is well placed to sort of do that, because they have actually some more legitimacy. They are this ruling government. They have connections with many of the people in the Haryana government are from farming families. There's much more connection there. And so I think that we have to see that game play out. I think this is a move at a time when I think there is a certain sense in which the state is feeling economically threatened because the economy isn't delivering as much as it was, and therefore there is a sense in which we want to somehow save money, and the states are wasting money, and there's all kinds of thoughts there which I think you can easily see where they come from. But I do think that there will be there are more rounds in this game to be played. It's an interesting. I think it's interesting. I'm really very interested in what's happening, and in particular what happens in Haryana now that the Haryana farmers have all joined or are joining. This is going to be interesting to watch what the government does. And I think that's going to be, if West UP starts joining in large numbers, that's going to be interesting. I feel there is more play in that game.
Thanks, Abhijit. We have some questions as well. Of course, there was a question on the farmers, I was going to ask you, but you've sort of covered a lot of territory. So I just want to take a couple of questions from the audience. One question is, I know I suppose you've been asked this often, and it's a long-standing debate, that do you think India can afford a universal basic income program, and that it's time that this is implemented?
I think that afford is the key word in a sense. It depends on what we think is inviolate. Right now, I would say any attempt to remove the food subsidy is going to be politically impossible. I think it's from both sides. The supply side is going to be furious because that's part of the government buys lots of grains and has to give, that's part of their commitment. And from the demand side, where people have been starving and they just went back to the village to get their rations and all that, I just think it's not a realistic. So right now, I think that if there is a universal basic income, it's going to be a tiny amount. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it might still create a mechanism for everybody to be, at least identify who is eligible, who are vulnerable people, and create pipelines. I think pipelines are, I think from when Aadhaar was mooted, this discussion of creating one single national pipeline to everybody was discussed. And I think it's a critical idea. I mean, if we have now, we've made lots of progress on the mobile platform. We've made lots of programs with Aadhaar, there are lots of issues with each of them, but nonetheless, I think in the next few years should be ones of solving those, and that would create. And then even if it's a few rupees, maybe a couple of 100 rupees, 400 rupees, it still will create a pipeline, and then you could, if necessary, you could put more money into it when there's a crisis. I do think that there's a real reason to build a very, I think right now, a very limited UBI, because I think that or at least some kind of a what we in our book call universal ultra basic income, UUBI, to something like that. I think it would be a good idea to try to build it. I think build it so that it works, make sure it works, so the next pandemic or something, other crisis, we are able to deliver without this panicked reaction. I think it's but I don't think it's going to be hugely fundable, especially given that the economy has shrunk and we're not in this growth, go-go growth years anymore, etc. So I don't think it's going to be fundable.
So
at any high level.
Understand you right, at some level, some basic cash transfer will coexist with the existing architecture of social security because of...
At least for now. At least for now. I mean, one hopes that eventually we'll have a rational infrastructure where all of these things are integrated in some rational way. But for now, I don't think you can take the Food Security Act away.
So Abhijit, I'll take one last audience question, and this is actually to Professor Abhijit Banerjee. It's about RCTs, and what do you have to say to critics of RCTs who say the approach is too specific to solve the vast development problems of poor countries? I know it's very difficult for you to answer this question in any sort of short time frame, but nevertheless, do you want to give it a shot? Or?
I give it a shot. I feel like I think the question is, what's the alternative? Ideology, ignorance. We can take your pick. I mean, I don't have a. Mostly we spend tons and tons of money on things which have, I think, no demonstrable value, and we continue to do that all over the world. Then we can say that, yes, I entirely agree that we often have to take decisions which we won't get the evidence for it, and I don't think the goal of the RCT movement is to say that everything needs an RCT. It's to say that, look, let's be aware of what the constraints are, what we don't know. Let's be much more mindful of what we don't know, where the evidence is weak. Sometimes we do where the evidence is weak because the alternative is to do nothing, and we can't do nothing. So I'm not in favor of abolishing everything that is not supported by an RCT evidence at all, the opposite. But I think that being mindful of the quality of evidence, and therefore being mindful of the need for evidence and the need for reform, is critical.
So Abhijit, we're almost out of time, and there are a bunch of questions I still had to ask you, especially on protectionism and the role of industrial policy over the past, 2 years. But I think we'll have another session completely on that. I just want to, because our 40 minutes are almost up, I want to ask a very practical last question. The budget is coming up at the end of January or early February. So what would you like, couple of suggestions to the finance minister, given what you have described about the state of the economy, about the sort of welfare losses because of people losing jobs? What is the couple of 2 or 3 things you would tell the finance minister to focus on?
I think that the things that would have a lot of visibility, which will make people think that there is a, Achhe Din is about to re-emerge. I think something which is, so I think infrastructure is a good, because I think infrastructure projects do have visibility, and people will start to think, okay, fine, something's happening. I think we're in a state of a bit of a paralysis. And I think getting out of that paralysis and a government that's focused on development, showing that it's focused on development, not just, I think people understand that you have to bail out banks and things like that, but I don't think it excites anybody. I really do think that, I think the loan write-offs were good, but now that loans are coming due, people are worried about selling. And I think they really would like a assurance that the growth is going to be restored and the government will do whatever it takes. So I would start sending signals that the government has a commitment to growth. I think that's the only way in which you get people out of this state of not spending, not moving, not doing anything, not investing. I think that needs to be. This is a moment. The budget there are many things that I would like, but what can the budget do? I think this is what the government will send a strong pro. We will do whatever it takes message.
Abhijit Banerjee, as always, thank you so much for this session, full of insights, full of very interesting thoughts, and so wish you, I know you're in Europe right now, so wish you a very nice day ahead of you, and thanks so much.
Thank you for that. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Niranjan.